having me here again, especially Dr. A.J. Thomas, who is kind enough to have me here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to approach the question of translation from a different angle. And it's a kind of part of my ongoing project on critical history of Marathi literature. So the question of literary historiography and translation is what I am addressing right now. For that I have taken on board recent advances in translation studies and comparative literature, especially the notion of world literature as I think Professor Lee and Professor Anish Urama just touched upon, and the question of modernity. The recent advances in translation studies after 80s is the move for reorientation of translation studies away from the question of evaluation and strategies. The question of good, bad, right, wrong translation usually ends up in a kind of deadlock very often. And there is a shift towards more descriptive attitudes, approaches to the question of translation, looking at the ideological projects behind translation, and also look at functions of translation. So from that angle, I am looking at Bangla literature in Marathi as part of critical history of Marathi literature. And one of the arguments that I am developing is that the presence of Bangla literature in Marathi is so important to the development of Marathi literature and even Marathi literary culture, that we cannot just deal with the question of English Marathi as one of the relation to look at when we think of modernity, question of modernity. To give you an example, I will just cite some figures. There is Marathi Anuvad Granth Suchi, which is a bibliography of translated books into Marathi. And it does not take into account articles, poems, stories appearing sporadically, separately in various periodicals. But it does give a kind of overview of amount of Marathi literature, Bengali literature in Marathi. There are around 800 literary books from English to Marathi, into Marathi, 800. And the bibliography ends in 1998. The number would have definitely gone up in the past 2 decades. But, and there are around 500 books translated from Sanskrit into Marathi. That is probably the second biggest amount of translation done into Marathi. So first is English, second is Sanskrit. And the third is around 300 books from Bengali. And that must be between what, 1860 to 1998. 300 books. Approximately 60 books by Tagore in Marathi, including 9 translations of Gitanjali itself. Against 100 or more translations of Shakespeare's plays, around 70 books of Sharat Chandra, his novels and short story collection exists in Marathi. So if you look at just the quantitative part of it, we realize that Bengali literature is a major literary presence. So keeping that in mind, the argument that I am developing is, to put it in a nutshell, is that we have to expand the notion of cosmopolis that is developed by scholars like Sheldon Pollock and later by Richard Eaton. And the idea of cosmopolis is that it's a trans-regional idiom which is hegemonic, like Sanskrit, for example. So Pollock talks of Sanskrit cosmopolis, which would be extend from Afghanistan to Java, say for example. So that's the huge trans-regional domain of Sanskrit that exists in South Asia. Richard Eaton has talked about Persian cosmopolis, where the presence of Persian as one of the hegemonic idioms or registers across the world probably. So if you keep these two cosmopolis in mind, I go on to argue that apart from the third one, that is English, we have to look at the other cosmopolises within Indian languages, within South Asian languages, and for that I have coined the word called Bangla cosmopolis. Because probably in the languages that I know, that is Gujarati, Hindi, Marathi, Bangla is a huge presence. Means there was a period when most of the Gujarati writers were fluent in Bangla. So Buddhadev literature and culture after 1990s. So it's post 1919 sense of the word world literature that I am using the idea of Bangla literature as a world literature here. And a very interesting and important formulation is a well-known work by David Damrosch, where he says world literature encompasses all literary works that circulate beyond their culture of origin, either in translation or in original language. A work only has an effective life as world literature when it is actively present within a literary system beyond that of its original culture. And Damrosch goes on to argue that world literature is not infinite, ungraspable canon of works, but rather a mode of circulation and reading, a mode that is applicable to individual works as to the bodies of material, available for reading established classics and new discoveries alike. That is a quote by Damrosch. So if we use this idea, then we can look at Bhagavad Gita as world literature because its presence is spread across as part of Sanskrit cosmopolis. You can find Bhagavad Gita in Bengali as well as in Punjabi, as well as in Tamil. So it is, you can call it world literature, or Kabir or Tagore as we have been discussing. He also goes on to give example of Khalid's Persian poetry, which has not received the amount of attention it requires because most of them focus on his Urdu works. So that is Damrosch's work that I am drawing upon to rethink the idea of world literature. The other idea of world literature that has absolutely not been discussed, and it should have been discussed more in India, but we don't discuss things because probably they are not fashionable enough to be discussed, is Diamond Julius's notion of world literature based on the concept of interliterariness, where he emphasizes, instead of considering comparative literature in terms of influences, like Politker's influence on Malhotra or whoever. Instead of looking at it from the perspective of influences, we look at the processes involved. So he finds the word interliterary processes to describe these similarities and resemblances that we find across literary cultures. And he also argues that it operates at multiple levels. So, for example, one of the work that I did was on Jnaneshwari, coming to Bhakti literature, where Sheldon Pollock has argued that it is an example of vernacularization of Sanskrit into Marathi. While I have argued that it is more of an interliterary phenomenon, where Jnaneshwari is drawing upon a very folk meter called Ovi, which is largely used by women at grinding or in doing their domestic work to comment on a canonical text like Gita. And he converts the Tika form, that is the genre for reading, into genre for performance. So, in that sense, it's complete transformation of Bhagavad Gita into something else which is not vernacularization. It is not just adoption of Sanskrit model, but it operates at multiple levels. So, in considering 19th century Marathi or modern Marathi literature, it's not sufficient to look at English as one of the agents of modernization, which we often think of. So, and my argument is that you also have to take on board Bangla, at least, when we look at modernization of Marathi literature. And I will give you only a few instances and I will stop without taking much time. One is a very interesting one, and I have used the word Banglophilia to denote extreme form of love for Bangla. And the example is that of a person called A.R. Asgaonkar, who brought out a very influential journal called Masik Manoranjan, he changed his surname into Mitra. He loved Bangla so much. And most of his space in periodicals was given to translations from Bangla. And on the basis of Puja, Durga Puja special issues, he started Diwali special issues practice, which has become a kind of obsession in its own right. Means people pre-book Diwali issues, and it's in Marathi it's a huge deal, and it's not always very good. But it's a practice that has become synonymous with Marathi literature. But its source seems to go back to the Puja special day. Another very interesting instance is Bhargav Vittal Varerkar, or Mama Varerkar. He single-handedly translated all the novels of Sarat Chandra, long time before Sahitya Academy was formed. So here is an instance of translations from language to language happening, and the issue of English was raised in morning, that English is a hegemonic presence. There were such kind of practices where translations happened without any institutional support from one language to another. Another very famous instance is Lisa Khandekar, a very famous Marathi writer, translated completely into Gujarati to an extent that Gujaratis think that Khandekar is a Gujarati writer. So these translations were done without English as a linked language, without institutional support. So this mode of circulation that existed on the subcontinent before, without use of English very often, can easily be classified as world literature. And that is my argument. I will talk about another very interesting phenomena is the reform movement in Marathi. And Mama Varerkar himself belonged to the reformist school of intellectuals, influenced by Gandhi and later on by Marx, and he tried to find some sort of common ground between Gandhi and Marx. The reform movement in Bangla, and I would argue that something called Bangla Renaissance or Bengali Renaissance was kept as a kind of benchmark by many Indian languages, including Marathi and Gujarati, as a kind of model of negotiating colonial modernity. The way Bhadralok negotiated modernity in Bangla became something of to be emulated because it is Indian. It's not, you are not being directly influenced by English writers, but you are influenced by Bengali writers. And one play, very famous play called Neel Darpan, 1872 by Dean Bandhu Mitra, was translated into Marathi through English by Muro Vittal Valvekar, and it deals with this whole theme of oppression of indigo farmers at the hand of the British colonizers. And the play received a kind of flag saying that you should not criticize government. And probably that is an indicator of beginning of early nascent stage of nationalism in Marathi. And it became a controversial play because it attacked government, and if I am not mistaken, it was banned. In Marathi also, not just in Bangla. 12 novels of Bankim Chandra were translated by Bhargav Varerkar. One more influence of Bengali culture on Marathi would be after Bengal partition and the movement for its integration into reunification of Bengal influenced Marathi thinkers to think about something called Maharashtra, which was divided into various regions, and they imagined Maharashtra as a unified space as it exists today after 1960. And the model again is Bengal reunification movement. So earliest thinkers, they made a claim that all regions which are Marathi speaking should be brought into and made into a single unit called Maharashtra. So unless we take into account these cross-cultural linkages, we won't be able to write history of any Indian language by just looking at, say, for example, Sanskrit or English. So that's my argument. And there is a very famous novel called Mahanayak, based on the life of Subhash Chandra Bose by Vishwas Patil. So, Bengali culture and its presence within other Indian languages is a very important phenomenon to be analyzed if you are writing histories of those non-Indian bhasha, non-English bhasha literatures. So, with this I want to stop, and probably I haven't come across such information regarding Bangla cosmopolis, so I would be happy to learn from. This is an opportunity for me to learn from scholars across languages. So I want to stop here. Thank you.
The Bangla cosmopolis is alive and kicking. In Kerala, at least, and K.R. Veera's novel Tangoval is entirely set in Calcutta. It's about Bengal. It has nothing to do. There's a very small tangential connection to Kerala. That of the first character, negative protagonist actually. But otherwise, it's totally set in Calcutta. It's about the history of Bengal. It serves as a kind of parable, for India itself. And you would not believe it. She's been there for only she's visited Calcutta only 2 times in her whole life, for 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks. The entire novel is written like a translation of a Bengali novel. K.R. Veera. It's called Hangoman, the translation in English. I call it that. I said it's, because I wrote my translator's note, I kind of mentioned this, because we all grew up thinking that Sharachandra, for example, is Malayali. A whole bunch of people in Kerala were named Sharachandra. So many Sharachandras all over Kerala. And Vibhuti, for example, he thought was Malayali.
I think this practice has declined. It's translating from one bhasha to another without Hindi or English.
Kerala gets huge numbers. Kerala actually gets, Malayalam gets a lot of translations, and Malayalis are obsessed with Latin American translations. That's something you need to do. They sell as well or better than Malayalam.
Latin American translation through mediated through English or?
Through the market, sadly enough, very bad translations, but they sell.
May I just please? I'm feeling, I don't know if I'm right, but to better clarify and put my rest. I think that this world literature is a new body of literary colonialism.
Literary?
Colonialism. Because if the impact or the influence of one writer into other language or other areas of interpretation, for example, you mentioned it's the same value who was unknown till 1970, but the same value becomes a part of politics. So I think it's a colonial kind of a conspiracy rather than real literary communication. I think
world literature is not a singular category. It means there are multiple ways of thinking about world literature, and I have taken those which are suitable to Indian context, especially Dionysius Ulysses, who is in East European multilingual context and existing on peripheries of the hegemonic theory. I have used it in critical history of Marathi literature to look at how relations between Sanskrit and Marathi can be rethought by saying that it's not just adoption of Sanskrit, but it is a kind of transformation of Marathi Sanskrit models into something else, using folk, for example, drawing upon folk, drawing upon the theatre, maybe folk theatre. To comment on Bhagavad Gita, for example, Shankaracharya's commentary would be something to be read in isolation or before a temple. But nobody would read a commentary before a temple. It would be for scholars, by the scholars. But here is a commentary meant for ordinary people in a performative genre. So I have used it to rethink relation between cosmopolis, Sanskrit cosmopolis and Marathi.
Your take is very valid. I completely agree with what you say. But I have about doubts of pronunciation.
of world literature. Yeah.
May I say something?
It is hegemonic in some ways.
May I say something in this regard? Because this morning I wanted to address this in my paper. I cut it short. I feel that the category of world literature exists in two domains. One is in the academic domain. We have this formulation of world literature, where all these definitions come. If a particular author is translated and prescribed in for 5 or 6 universities in America, and much of it becomes world literature, right? But nobody else outside the academy cares for it. For me, world literature would mean those literature which circulate without this kind of academic agenda, something that I should just mention. So these are much fewer in number, and they do not happen just like somebody translates a few novels because an academic likes it, and then you think of world literature. All these
if you look at the category of popular, for example in Marathi and Gujarati, for example Tarzan or Alistair MacLean or Arthur Conan Doyle, then these have circulated outside the academia, driven by market in Indian languages. To say that it's merely a colonial model would be to overlook the idea that world literature is not a set of just canon or just a set of great books, but a mode of circulation outside. So Gitanjali is definitely world literature for me because there are 9 translations of Gitanjali in Marathi, and it has influenced Gujarati literature as well as Marathi literature, development of Marathi poetry or Gujarati poetry, and this has played a role. So I think that that can be a helpful tool to look at in comparative studies. If we decolonize, make it non-Eurocentric, we can use the idea of world literature in a fruitful way. That's my take on it.
It's like clarification. So you're using it mainly a clarification. So you're using it, so you're looking at India then as a multilingual society and as world itself. That is what you're doing. You're not, though India technically some.
For example, in Tugaram could not be understood without Kavi.
Yes.
So
it is not essential that it needs to travel outside of India.
No.
India as long as
because there's a mode of circulation outside its circle, the culture of origin would include Ramdev in the Guru Granth Sahib. So Kabir and Ramdev for me would be able to share.
I think it's a very rich area. For example, I was very surprised when I found that when I was translating the writings of first generation feminists in Kerala who wrote articles in the 1890s and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, I discovered that a lot of their metaphors, etc., had traveled. Basically, like Tarabai Shinde, for example. We have no evidence that the text was translated into Malayalam. It actually appeared in Malayalam very recently. I mean, 2-3 years back. But the metaphors and the examples and many other bits and pieces, fragments.
I think the connecting link can be will, because the subjugation of women was an important text that was being discussed in those circles, and Tarabai Shinde was part of Pule's movement.
So it could have come to Tamil, for example.
Or through common sources like
Yes.
these.
Right. Very possible.
I'm just thinking if two even words is
Well, cosmopolitanism is a difficult category to define. If you make it Eurocentric, then it becomes a hegemonic.
because the person who's all the pages of the passport has outside India and doesn't become what is similar in politics. It's very amorphous kind of thing. To me it seems.
I think we can use it for, as a tool, we can use it to maybe open up certain things. So I would consider
I
it.
suppose the way text travels is different. It doesn't need that kind of passport stamping. Some people, some maybe, they might need the stamping of some
For example, Guru
published.
Nanak would be a system before cosmopolitanism, capitalist cosmopolitanism was thought of. So I think we have to use Western categories for ourselves by decolonizing them to see what it opens up further. With definitely your intervention in mind that this can be hegemonic in itself. Thank you for all the
Devika is a feminist researcher and teacher at Center for Development Studies, Kerala, who has contributed to the understanding of the history of gender, development, politics, culture of modern Kerala. Her work is interdisciplinary and she brings to bear her training as a historian on contemporary issues. She is interested in opening up the boundaries between academic and public and pedagogic discourses, the social sciences, and humanities in English and Malayalam. She also translates literature and social science between Malayalam and English and writes occasionally for children, besides offering commentary on contemporary literature. Just a while ago, referring to her translation of the Woman of Aracha by Mira, for which the work was shortlisted for the BSc Prize. And very recently she has translated one hell of a hour is a collection of stories by Undi R. He is one of the most leading kind of story writer of the build. You can't call him a millennial, but he bloomed. And she has done a wonderful translation. Just now we were having this discussion about hegemony of position of that. I believe she has made again the language of her own, like Undi did.
Welcome to the second session. Okay.
Abhirami Gildas who lives in Chennai, is an editor and translator. Having worked in publishing for over a decade, she is particularly interested in literature and translation from Tamil and Malayalam. She has reviewed fiction for India Today, the Indian Express, and the book review, translated CIF's short story from Malayalam for the Oxford India Anthology of Malayalam Dalit Writing. She is one of the translators of Naval, a collection of 23 Malayalam short stories by Dalit writers, edited by M.R. Kumar, who is a leading poet of Malayalam, published in English as Don't Broadcast, published by Navya in 2017. And one of the editors of Salt and Pepper, Silver Linings, the celebrating of campuses. Read Me Books, 2019. Currently, she is chief sub-editor of the Frontline magazine. Asya Sabu teaches at the college in Baramulla, Kashmir. Asya has studied at the University of Oxford, Kashmir University, and yeah, sorry about that. Can't help it. She has authored books, has published poems and academic articles and book reviews. Her major writing is on heritage diaspora, South Asian literature, particularly Kashmiri literature, psycholinguistics, and film. Asya has spoken at literary festivals as well as national and international academic platforms. Asya has received many awards and fellowships and has curated a website Goldbush, Goldbush.net, to document literature and languages of Kashmir. Dr. Mastin Bilal is the author of Whistle-Nama poems from Delhi, Belfast and Urdu, Yola Press, 2019, and the translator of Figures, Tasnavi, Chata Darya in English, and the Sixth River, a journal from the Partition of India, from State Tiger, 2019. He's associate professor of literary studies at the Liberal Arts School of Chicago Global University.
So welcome all of you to this session. So we will start with Mars Fest. Okay, so
Thank you, Mr. Viva, and thank you, Mr. Thomas, for inviting me here. It's been an honor, and it's a difficult act I have to follow after Dr. Kedkar's wonderful paper, which was conceptually very nuanced and opened almost new field of study in some ways. I, on the other hand, and I see that the paper has been separated. I have sent it to Dr. Thomas, but I didn't know it was going to be separated. This is a longer paper, of which I'm going to read some excerpts and talk about it. It comes off my practical translation of, I suppose, of Sadat Manto's story, Holi. That translation was published on World Disability Day, I believe, a couple of years back, on Scroll. So if you want to read that, if you're curious about it, you can find it online. As the paper says, the title of it, Translating Disability in and from Urdu, Manto's Gunshot. What I try to do here then is to look at the experience of translation of experience itself into writing as kind of cultural translation. So translation as metaphor for writing and expression itself has been carried across. When a non-disabled writer is writing about disability, so I begin there. And how other writers have done it in Urdu. I do comparison in the paper with Manto's short story of that. And then the second part of the paper, and this part also focuses on the nature of Urdu itself, and then what that brings to the understanding of disability, to writing about disability in Urdu. And from there I moved into my experience of having translated this text from Urdu to English, and what were the challenges I faced there. So these are some of the aspects of the paper. I'd like to highlight one more thing before I begin the paper, which is to focus on Manto's writing itself, and Manto being a famous author, popular through a world literature writer, I suppose, according to Kedkar's formulation. He has been translated across the country and across the world in many languages. The focus on his writing has largely been on his writings about partition and about sometimes prostitutes or other kinds of disputes. There are other aspects to Manto, and this story, the attempt to translate that was also an attempt to highlight that. So with those kinds of caveats, I'd like to begin. So I begin by unpacking the writing itself. I begin with the etymology of the word translation as being carried across, and then look at how a non-disabled writer is trying to carry across the understanding of a word or the experiences of the word from a disabled person's perspective. So this accentuates the social sides of disability that disability studies has for a while now tried to foreground over the bodily and personal dimensions. So the essential question, so it's a two-part kind of paper. It's partly about translation, partly about disability also. And disability studies as question you have heard. Disability itself, disability studies is also a question whether a non-disabled person can express for the disabled. So things like that are what I'm trying to get at. So I'll read in chunks then. Society of Modern Disability Studies has now pointed out for decades is responsible for disability by its material, infrastructural and institutional constructions that preclude access and lead to exclusion. Therefore, at the level of policy at least, recent disability students and activists have demanded, and I quote from here, a necessarily fundamental reordering of global priorities and resources based on equality, respect and control of resources by the people and communities that need them. Then, can we imagine the non-disabled to understand experiences of the disabled and to articulate them at all? Rather, these attempts fated to perpetuate the oppression society is often guilty of. Can only disabled authors write about or translate disability? Does this condemn the role of the non-disabled author as translator of disability into representation and discourse also? And furthermore, the position of the translator of such a work. Manto is such a non-disabled author, as am I, the translator of this short story on disability, Woli. The paper explores the challenges and achievements of the cultural, social and symbolic translation of disability by Manto in a short story, while comparing it to another Urdu short story, I won't actually do that comparison as strongly. I foreground Mando for today, but the longer it refers to that, and place them among other related Urdu literature. It further analyzes the challenges, achievements, and losses in translation for Gunshot as a translation of Mando's short story into English, with a focus on the conceptual and cultural changes that are traversed from Urdu into English. While the question of the non-disabled translators, authors, success or failure is a large question that remains not quite possible to answer within this paper, the essay elucidates the achievements of Mando and analyzes the challenges faced by its translator. I guess I've been a little repetitive, as I've already explained this, but anyway, I'll move on. Translation in Urdu then. The words for translation and translator in Urdu are tarjuma and tarjuman. They expand translation from English translation as carrying across, which may be perfunctory. I mean, simply carrying across could be carrying from here to here. But tarjuma, as a word itself, also lends towards some other semantic approximations into the terms of interpretation, commentary, and explanation. So I think that we're trying to do tarjuma, and is already moving ahead from at least the limited word that is translation, and I will show soon the translation of the word disability itself too, and the differences there culturally. The burden upon the translator, author in Urdu then, seems to be already larger, if not heavier. The Urdu tarjuman or translator therefore seems to have far more diverse and detailed role by definition than an English translator, who by etymology seems more focused upon carrying across what is most likely meaning. So touching upon something that Professor Rahman was talking about, there's also a need to focus on form, which perhaps I do not do as strongly in this short story translation, but I do more strongly in my book of poetry, Nama, where I have a section of translation from Khalid, and I translate Khalid in form, but I also translate the form itself into English as, say, the four-year Shangeli, and write ghazals in English. But even the story, I'm trying to do it in different ways, with special regard to the conceptual and sometimes formalistic choices that Mando makes as well. So for the Urdu translator, there are the extra requirements of the elaboration of the objects of their translation. Urdu authors have taken up this task of interpreting or translating the world around 62 as they try to provide glosses on the surroundings as seen by them for their readers. However, they often do so with sentimentality and notes of lament. So I have a section here which is called Notes of Lament in Urdu, and I try to argue, carrying on with others again, Mohammad Sadiq in his published by Scientific is A History of Urdu Literature, remarks that various causes have led to a certain note of pessimism in Urdu literature. And some of these causes, the reliefs are originally despotism, the deteriorating Mughal Empire, the mutiny retributions in North India, around the major centers of the language, that is Delhi and Lucknow, and so on and so forth. One could now add the partition of 1947 and the status of Urdu as a language in India and even in Pakistan, and what language politics has done around it. So one notes a certain note of lament in a lot of literature. There are other cultural reasons for it too, such as the form of the Marsiya, which comes from the Shia tradition, which is also a prominent form, which is a form of lament, a form of elegy that is formalized. So due to these, there are already notes of lament in the literature. And then when this relates to disability, disability too is treated perhaps largely by and large, and I'm not talking about Mando here, but often in other stories by others, and I gave a few case studies here apart from Mando, is treated with a note of lament. There isn't something that is radically constructive vis-a-vis disability. Apart from Mando, I would argue that Mando is perhaps more constructive in many ways and or radical, showing various hypocrisies about it. So the story that I've chosen to translate and that I've compared with another story is Goli. It is a story about a disabled girl. But as a point of comparison, I would like to perhaps summarize, not quite summarize, but use the other story that I compare it to as an example to represent other stories of what is the status of women vis-a-vis the disability, particularly often in these stories. Disabled women particularly are almost this patriarchal object that are in some way or the other to be married. That is the example that I gave of the other story, and in a way, that is what Manto's story is about too. About which I'll read the summary of it. So just make some general remarks about women with disability here. A girl or a woman with disability often becomes a doubly pitiable object whose impending marriage or lack of one is the abiding concern of those around, not just on account of her gender, but also her disability. And then I speak about the other stories. I'm not going to talk about today so much. Manto has picked up on a similar theme, but he writes about it with quite a different slant. So, to talk about Manto's deconstruction of Urdu conventions of disability from page 8, in a modern story that preceded Usmani's failure to I don't need to read this, sorry. Sadatan Manto questions easy assumptions and spawns superficial sympathy or pity. Manto's Boli from 1950, or Gunshot, as I translated it, is similarly a story of a man offering to marry a young girl with a paralyzed lower body. However, the treatment of disability and social attitudes to disability are quite different from Usmani. In a conventional sense, the marriage of a girl with disability remains a common trope, but the layered response to it among the story's characters is far more nuanced. Manto explores traditional idealism, revealing the true difficulty in translating disability for the so-called normal subject. As an author, he remains aware of the distance with which other non-disabled characters seek to engage with disability, and the immediate forced manner in which they resort to sympathy. Manto blasts through this forced sympathy. The title of the story, Urdu Boli, literally meaning bullet, translates better as a fired ammunition or as gunshot, for the charge that the story carries and the powerful note that it ends on, charting all things to an easy translation or understanding of the disabled by the non-disabled. I can compare it with Usmani little, but Manto's Gunshot, written with the narrator almost sitting on the shoulder of the main protagonist, Shafqat, undoes the false realism and sarcastically shows up the narrator's highfalutin sympathies for a sad and morose object of pity, the young girl Nihal. Let's explain the story now. The entire story is set in Shafqat's house, beginning in the drawing room and ending in his bed. The wife and two daughters of a long forgotten family friend, Aziz Sahib, are visiting and Shafqat returns home one day. His wife, Aisha, privately tells Shafqat that they have returned from Africa to find suitable rooms for the girls. The women are already seated as Shafqat is introduced to them. Talat, the younger daughter, is lively, engaging and interested. Nikat, the elder, is brooding and pensive. For the longest time, Shafqat tries to engage Nikat, who draws him in through her reclusive appearance. Shafqat wonders at her silence even during the animated discussions of the merits of Africa over India, as he does not know nor realize that the lower body is paralyzed. He asks her to accompany him into the other room to look at his photo albums, which she politely refuses. He seems to think her snobbish or ill-behaved and takes some jibes at her, only to put his foot in the mouth. When it is the turn of the Aziz women to leave, both Mrs. Aziz and Talat have to help Nighat to get up and walk away, as her lower body turns out to be paralyzed. Shafqat cannot curse himself enough at this point for having berated the young girl for being so quiet. However, soon upon their leave, his friends show up and he forgets Nighat in his game of cards. Thus, Shafqat is first insensitive to the disabled Nighat by refusing to even conceive of a differential ability for basic access and mobility. But on seeing the difficulty finally manifest, he responds with immediate superficial sympathy without any genuine concern that he then soon forgets in his pleasure with his friends, and showing a remarkable lack of genuine feeling. In the other story that I compared this to, the girl had been disabled then too, and a suitor had come and then not accepted for marriage because of her disability. And another friend had sort of arisen at that moment to offer to marry her. And that in a way is a trope that one sees across many stories, which is what I'm comparing Manto's story to. Manto, on the other hand, now he already displays both commonly available middle class disregard as well as superficial legal guilt towards the disabled in this story. He only further exacerbates it as the story goes on to deflate the ego of his middle class male protagonist, showing all of these symptoms. Once the friends leave in Manto's story, Shafqat remembers Nighat again and castigates himself for having forgotten her. In bed at night, cuddling his wife Aisha, he goes over the day's events with her and together they commiserate with the poor girl whom no man would be willing to marry. Aisha is particularly damning of men as no compassion. Shakta has earlier condemned God and creation or nature for the cruelty towards one such as Megha, who is an acknowledged beauty and a good, sweet girl and would be a grand success but for her disability. This is Shakta talking. A suitable marriage remains the one supreme conundrum as well as the desired solution to Nighat's supposed difficulty and difficult position in life. Shafqat makes up his mind to help Nighat and is assured by his wife that she will support him in this. It is as he divulges his grand scheme to Nighat that it all falls to pieces. I'll quote the concluding section because it's quite instructive to the translation as I've done it, and I will talk about it from there on. So the ending is like this. Aisha took a deep sigh. Will she be vexed like this all her life? No, said Shafqat and sat up. What do you mean? Aisha asked. You have sympathy for her? Of course. Swear on it? Oh, what's the need to swear on this? All humans must show sympathy to her. Shafqat said after a silence of a few moments. Then I have decided. Aisha responded excitedly. What? I have always thought of you as a high-minded woman. Today you have proven my impression right. May God keep me firm in my resolve. I have decided that I will marry you. You will get all the rewards in heaven for it. So he's basically offering to marry Nighat also while remaining married to Aisha. Silence reigned for a while. Then it seemed as if a bomb had exploded. Shafqat Sahib, I will shoot you dead if you marry her. Shafqat felt as if he had been hit hard by a bullet. And being dead, he buried himself into his wife's embrace. That's how the story ends. Mantu's short story pierces like a bullet, blast open like a gunshot. It's not just Shafqat who buries himself into his wife's embrace, but the very structures of society, its propriety, its hollow claims to sympathy, all dissolve into it. People's real intolerance and exclusion of those it considers disabled become palpable. In the silence and dialogue of the couple, the silence of the quiet Nighat, the disabled object first of their commiserations and then of Nighat's ire and Shafqat's capitulation, becomes even more significant. Mantu ironizes his own ability or that of writers in general, or those from Urdu in particular, perhaps in non-disabled authors to write or translate disability into their stories. He lampoons the sentimentalism that is immediately invoked, the pity and false sympathy that are offered that rarely result in actual deeds and are quickly and easily forgotten and dismissed. The capacity of disability to disable the creative writer's hold on another lived reality is represented here by Mantu with the deft strokes of minimalist irony that have become characteristic of the great writer. In a laconic manner, he sees through the facade maintained by his characters and his intense pessimism and skepticism about society are evident. There are possibly the effects of his own sensibility greatly affected by the partition of India as an Urdu writer and non-Muslim forced to move to Pakistan. I do not think Mantu would have thought of representing disability or people's responses to it as necessarily acts of translation of tarjuma or as whole as that of a tarjumana. Nonetheless, if he were to speak in this vocabulary, he would certainly question the lofty claims to being a good interpreter or commentator. Mantu never explains, he only shows, and only that which he thinks he can see. Mantu ironizes the very sentimental attitude and superficiality that other writers often make found to adopt. Translating this challenge to a conventional narrative then becomes a great challenge in itself, and I will discuss that from here on. So the strategies to translate Mantu's depiction of disability that I try to adopt are, as we go on, I'll discuss them. The challenges of translating the story and disability therein are also therefore embroiled in the knack for showing without telling, interpreting without laying claims to full mastery, or complete powers over narration. The question of the translation, too, like the original story, is to be suggestive rather than didactic. The ending, for example, with a metaphoric gunshot needs to be built towards from within the story without a comment on or easy clue to its final unfolding. Like, there's great surprise in Mantu's story at the end, and that I think needs to be retained. One needs to be in tune with the final emotional vocabulary of Urdu and of English to convey same sentimental emotion, which should appear sincere and genuine on immediate reading, but in hindsight may be remembered as disingenuous or affected as this deep ironies Mantu's main ploy. So to go back to what Professor Namik was talking about, the idea that there are things, there is that God particle, she was calling it as things that are resistant to translation. But at the same time, one has to try to maintain that emotion in the target language as well, without losing it. And an emotion that exists in a particular language. A language that has a particular history, an historical almost evolution towards this note of lament and greater sentimentality, as I try to almost highlight in short. One needs to somehow try to adopt English to that, which is what I try to do. Such remarks as Shafqat's following diatribe against nature have the potential for genuine emotional rancor as well as hypocrisy that are sought to recreate in translation. I quote, "Why is nature so cruel? Such a beautiful girl, treated so cruelly, so ruthlessly. What was this innocent's fault that she was punished so harshly?" End quote. I've also retained terms of personal address such as Ammi-jan, Bhai-jan, I'm not going to explain these here, Adab, etc. to retain the original flavors of a cultivated and sentimentalized society with an emphasis on decorum, propriety and manners. This allows for the appropriate texture to the story in English so as to convey the stress on courtesy but also the subsequent hypocrisy here. However, as part of these cultural responses and despite the hypocrisy, the attitude to disability is nonetheless different from the Western. And in a way, this is the heart of the argument that I'll now get through. This creates different challenges for translating disability to. These I discuss in the next section, which I call translating Urdu rogue vis-a-vis Western disability. The sentimentality of emotions in Urdu culture and literature also results in lexical choices in the original Urdu that tend to treat disability itself as less differently pathological and exclusionary than the post-enlightenment English word disability. In a leisurely loose way, the far more recently feudal Urdu most often consider disability a rogue or affliction, like other diseases. This is how Mantrosh Shafqat regularly refers to Nichols' ailment. The rogue may be employed for matters of the heart in a poetic fashion too in Urdu repertoire. In Unani and Ayurveda systems of medicine, rogue is employed as a term for affliction, disease, ailment, and even pain and disorder among the body's elements, but does not really suggest disability, the way it suggests so in the Western canon. Thus there seems a suggestion that the rogue may be curable, in a way that disability perhaps isn't. Disability is probably more permanent. It does not carry the same finality or social exclusions as disability seems to suggest in the Western conception of it on its writing in English fiction. There is no clear setting aside of the afflicted in Urdu as opposed to the disabled in English. Any person may get an affliction that may then be treated. The individual is not immediately outside the body politic, in the way the implications seem to be both lexically in English and socially in the West. We must remember that Nazi Germany was not just persecuting Jews, but it was also persecuting the disabled in the gas chambers. Where disability is the immediate opposite or negative, this of ability, a rogue closer to an affliction is what may affect anyone and still not set them in opposition to or outside of their individual or a social ability. This means less of a stigma on disability. I try to argue for which a word such as ikhtiyari or lacking agency may be found to create a near literal translation. However, such words are rarely, if ever, used in such cases. Mazur is another word that is used to refer to the disabled, but it is also employed for the old and comes closer to helplessness. Mantu largely retains rogue with its more open connotations. Shafqat's wife uses the word apahij or paraplegic or handicapped ones to refer to Nigat to emphasize how no man will marry such a girl. So this then is keeping with social conventions. I think Mantu intentionally gives this to the wife. And therefore, thereby she speaks from a crude social perspective. However, Mantu's own references to Nigat and those voiced through Shafqat retain this more equivocal, lexical choice of rogue. An affliction or disease retains the scope of being ubiquitous and also of being cured. Thus, in both Mantu's, again I do sort of comparison, which is then not quite up to here. The attempts then finally to retain this distinction between rogue as opposed to disability set out clearly in the translation of Boli by using affliction and never disability. That is my translation choice. This allows for a relatively greater inclusivity to the characters within familial and even social circles, even as the larger patriarchal malaise of the obsession with women's marriage cannot be set aside. In Mantu's story, Nigat is the object of a mother's doting and is held generously and ungrudgingly by her sister. She's paying a social visit in the little minute that this story is, and certainly not excluded on account of a rogue, and certainly therefore not disabled. So I think these are quite categorical choices that one needs to make while at least focusing on disability between English and Indian languages. At least some of my argument I will conclude. Mattu's story questions the more cliché treatment of physical disability in Urdu fiction, casting doubt on the claims to translating disability and sympathy into language. Thus, Mattu problematizes the position of non-disabled author generally as well as in Urdu, in particular by questioning his particular sentimentality. The role of a non-disabled translator, such as myself, perhaps remains less questionable as I translate the work of a non-disabled author, although it remains important to maintain the cultural nuance of the original Urdu, especially as the conceptual understanding of disability itself is at stake. Thus, translating Mattu's short story remains a challenge due to the limited scope for ambiguity in English, whereas Goli in Urdu may connote the physical object as well as the violence discharged with the bang. In English, bullet does not evoke the latter as easily, whereas my chosen title, Gunshot, must necessarily forego the latent and embodied potential for explosion and violence. Similarly, one must be careful in using or in fact avoiding the term disability, which is not employed in Urdu, with its more definitive and negative and exclusionary import. There are various things that aid the characters of Urdu fiction and that of Manto's in particular, disability being only one of them and almost at par with any other rogue. Still, he is astute in recognizing the personal shortcomings of the so-called normal individuals in surpassing it to have a meaningful engagement with the disabled. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I think yes, I think this is a very interesting paper. Thank you very much. And I think we add another layer to our discussion because we're talking about the translation of experience in the first place by the author. A particular kind of experience which is not easy to share. So how that is done, and then you also moved on to asking questions about how this representation itself, this representation which is revolutionary in the sense that it blows off, the sympathy, the usual sympathy response. So how do you translate such a complex, revolutionary kind of representation? And I think you've given us some good pointers on how that can be done. Careful attention to the words used, etc. I was thinking, when you were talking, I was thinking about the Malayalam author Katharajan, who was one of the few Malayali authors who broached the question of homosexual love, same-sex love in the 1960s in some of his stories, usually about lesbian love. And it's very interesting how he never speaks about lesbian love, ever. He's always talking about extremely intimate friendship between two women. And leaving it at that, never, just talking about the intensity of your feeling and personal attachment, but never giving that sentiment a name. Staying completely outside. So there is an ethics to representation, and thank you for raising the question. Questions can come after the three papers. So can I? Okay, so alright, so then let's move on to Asya.
Thank you very much, first of all, Sahitya Academy for inviting me over. And thank you, all of you, and I must congratulate all of you for doing the translation because it's I think, the most challenging and most ungrateful job as well. So I call this translation as a crossing over languages. Crossing over is it's a term I've taken from genetics, which is very far-fetched, but I'll come to it later. So I must confess, for which you might kill me later, that I came to translation for the love of my mother rather than for the love of literature. So I started translating into my mother's short stories, but otherwise I feel that translation is a very tough job, to be somebody's host and to put a whole lot of effort into somebody else's work, and it still remains their work, it isn't your work. But anyway, so there are so many questions that have already been asked, and theorists and scholars have, time and again dealt with. So what is translation, for example? Who can translate? What is lost? What is gained? And all kinds of things. And what is the relation between the translated text and the original? So yeah, and it's moved on from like being a copy earlier, or a shadow of the text, to the transcreation and make it new kind of slogans. And yeah, but the one thing has been very constant, that is the going back, that kind of insecurity towards the original, saying that what happens to the original language, what happens to the original text. But I do also feel a little bit of guilt for the target language, because after all, it's that language which is lending itself open, giving the way it's ordered, giving the way it's structured, and cultural connotations in order to accommodate another language, another meaning, which is not indigenous to it. So maybe there also I was just a little bit concerned. So there's this hierarchy between the original and in this hierarchy, the original is always at the higher pedestal, and the target language is not. So Professor Rahman in the morning talked about Hala Shankari. So I'd like to talk about this, one of his books where he translates spells. It's called The Rebels Sepoite, and in that book he translates Tazimuth as his ghazals, and this was actually presented at the Katha Colloquium as part of the first Katha Utsav in 1991. So sensorily suggesting the dichotomy with sort of original and the translate, he also brings in a sort of gendered hierarchy, I would say. So Shahid says, my first sensuously vivid encounter with Faiz Ahmed Faiz is the voice of Begum Akhtar singing his ghazals. She sang him and other Urdu poets as no one's has since her death in 1974, 10 years before he died, which other singer can get the way she did, a raga of the ghazal, and then make the raga, the melodic archetype, feel grateful for being given. So, I stress the word grateful here. Passion, color, attachment, something that has the effect of covering the hearts of men. That is what the Sanskrit term raga literally means. One interpretation of the ghazal is whispering words of love, and in melodic idea that uses at least 5 tones of the octave. Each raga has a distinct room of ascent and descent, prescribed resting places, characterized spaces, and a distinct pause of its own. What Begum Akhtar did was to place the ghazal gently on the raga, still the raga opened itself. That whispered loud, gave himself willingly, guiding the syllables of the prescribed resting places, till note by syllable, syllable by note, the two merged into another compelling thought. She, in effect, allowed the ghazal to be caressed into music, translated, as it were. So here he uses the word translated. In putting the ghazal into a raga, he uses the word translated, and he says that the raga is grateful. Now you see, even something as sublime as raga has to be grateful to the original. So that is the kind of hierarchy which all this suggests. And one must also see that the very the title Rebels Sepoite is like it's talking about shadow, and one cannot stop but going back to Plato and thinking of translations as merely imitation. So that is one thing. Then Shahid goes on to in one of the poems which he calls homage to Fez and the Fez in one, so the sort of conversation between, imaginary conversation between Ali and Fez, but he explains his role as translator and connection with Fez's Urdu language. One of the poems brings forth the art of this poem brings the difficulty of the art of translating Fez. So he says, your lines were measured so carefully to become in one's veins the blood of prisoners. In the free words, another language, I imprisoned each line where I touched my own exile. The hush when the ghazals laid my palms was accurate as it is thus hush falls, which falls at the news of your death over Pakistan and India and all of us. No longer there is someone you spoke in Urdu, but still waited fast for that God, that woman, that friend, the revolution to come at last. And because you waited, I listened as you passed with some song, a memory of Musk, the rebel face of home. So then he says that he is a bilingual. I mean, he always said that he's bilingual to Urdu and English. His mother tongue was basically Urdu. So he says he is a bilingual, he says. What is someone to have nearly two equal loyalties to do but lend almost a gift then to each other and hope that sooner or later the wrong will be forgiven and they will become each other's. When I was thinking of the title of my translation, my double loyalty rescued me rather than hampering me by gifting the rebel's poetic shadow, which is at the same time an imitation, which I already discussed, is like, he talks about this as, which of course brings the idea of that imitation. I just, so I'll read another of his poem, which was like, he wrote it much before this translation, but it also has some kind of effect on some kind of hybridity which he wanted to attain in his poems. Call me a poet, dear editor. They call this my alien language. I'm a reader in words that mix cultures and leave me interested. Then he raises a doubt in one of his, about talking about his rootlessness. He raises a doubt in the same paper that I referred to just now. Then he raises a doubt: would I be able to make English behave outside its aesthetic habits? So that's a challenge and some kind of hegemony of the original language rather than the target language. We're talking about the hegemony of the English language, but in this case there is the hegemony of the original, because the original is dictating that it should be such, but but water management, for example, has a different opinion from what Shankar says. He says that the translatability of the text is within the texture of the text itself. It is the texture of the text which decides whether it would be translated or not. But the discussion here is the nature of the language that is translated text, which occupies the in-between space between the two languages, which brings to a large question as to what is the language then. So if we are translating these languages, if the language, the target language is bringing in the semiotics, the syntax, and the cultural connotations and everything, then it becomes a third language, a buffer language between the two languages. Then it doesn't remain the same language. So in one of his essays on linguistic translation, Roman Jacobson says that there are three types of translation, which are interlingual translations, interpretation of the verbal signs, and interpretation of the verbal signs by means of other verbal signs to a different language, and intersemiotic translation or transmutation. So the idea is that it's not only the content but also the order, the structure of the language, and also the tone of the language which have to be translated. So I'm bringing my own experiences, like what I, the difficulties I have, encountered while translating these, some of the texts, and some of my friends also have encountered. This is a great opportunity to, to learn from, maybe get a feedback from, or some, advice from all of you. So first of all, I'll deal with meaning. So my experience in translation from Kashmiri to English, which are culturally very different languages, short stories, which is called Dusa. Dusa in Kashmiri is a Pashmina shawl, like a bigger one, with the men wear. So in that story, there is this little girl and her mother. So the father is working in Bombay in an emporium where he's selling Pashmina, but he never was in a possession of one. So at one occasion, the wife decides that I want to be a Pashmina shawl for my husband, without telling the husband. So in this, there are so many difficulties in translating the story. First of all, the very process of spinning the wool on the charkha, the taking the yarn and taking those threads with hands, then putting it into water and draining that. Then it's a process very similar to something of kneading, as you knead the dough, but not very similar. So all these are very jargon words, particular to that profession, which do not have any equivalent in any other language, even not in the original languages, let alone English language. So this was one difficulty. And then there is another difficulty, which is to transport the emotion of this language. So this weaving of Pashmina or the spinning of the charkha is not generally neutral. It has different connotations when a woman is doing Pashmina and when a man is doing Pashmina. When a woman is doing Pashmina, it means that the man is not capable enough to sustain, because where the story is set. It's set somewhere like when my mother was younger. And then it also has other connotations of, like, it has also very connotations related to religion. For example, they would say that the Prophet's daughter, though it has no hadith or no justification, I have not read it anywhere, but in Kashmir there is some kind of belief that Prophet's daughter used to do this. She used to do the weaving and all. So that makes it sacred. So there is a kind of, and then other, famous, we're talking about Laldev, you might have heard of the mystic poet. So it said that Laldev was doing this spinning, which what usually women do with, within very secret, private spaces. In order to help their husbands, but not also let them feel the shame of it, that the wife is, helping. Or most of the times they would use it for, like, children's education. When there was a very tough time, they would get their money. And most of them even are today, and demonetization kind of made them, that was a very ugly direction, so let's go back. So this money was usually, they would keep that as a secret money, so it was all very secretive. And then they said that when Haba Khatun was, she was weaving, and then she had this wool, and her, in-laws, when I found out, she threw it in Dal Lake, and therefore the Nadu emerged. This is just a bit, Nadu has that hair, Laldev, she was spinning in Dal Lake, and then the Nadu, the lotus stem, which we eat. The lotus stem has that Nadu, it's a thing that we eat. It has those hair lights, so you feel that it has some, when you bite it, it has some hair. So they say it's so if there is at the same time a sacredness, kind of a piety and a shame attached to this. And now to transport this into shame because these ladies this would mean that the family is not having enough wealth to sustain itself, but therefore the women also have to be, that kind of a thing. Not the shame. Yeah, it is, of course, but we have to take it in that historical sense when it was, now there are all kinds of occupation that women do. But this was mostly not the stigma or something, but just they don't want to give it away. They go, family ki shaan rakhenge, hamara paas acha khasa paisa hai, we are valuable. So that kind of a sense, that kind of a, see, not actually, shame would be too big a sense, that's why I'm saying there's no equivalent. But some kind of unease saying that, and also the piety of being associated with Prophet's daughter already done there. And this kind of a mixture, which is oxymoronously, is very difficult to attain in, say, for example, in English language. So that was another, challenge that I found.
Why did you choose this story?
Because it is my mother's story. got you, like the son or a daughter, on the bull money, it means extreme sacrifice, piety, and all the kind of things, that. So this is, how do you transfer these words where there is not even an allusion to that. This is the absent paradigm. There's no allusion to it. You cannot explain it. So that is one thing. So how many changes, what change can the foreign language be put through in order to accommodate this kind of thing? So another cultural aspect of the meaning and transferring of words of endearment. So you might find it funny and unbelievable, but we Kashmiri people are filled with love from head to toe. So it is, so for you the love is just in the heart, but for us it is like the zoo from the mind. I will sacrifice my love, my life for you. Let me give my kidneys to you. Grandma's one day. I'll put you inside my liver. Now to make the liver or a kidney a poetic organ, so it's like a bit of a quadrille in English. So but now if you say I'll wrap you in my liver, it would evoke some image like a fatty liver syndrome or something like that.
It's not a Kashmiri trait, it's also a Malayali trait for your beloved your liver.
Yeah, also in Persian tradition, maybe it also Persian also comes from there. So, but it's all like Kashmiri is like all the organs. You give away all shush, like your lungs. Lungs also you give away. Yeah. So hearts. Yeah. So that is the kind of yeah. So coming to form now, so every language is a limitation as to how much malleable it would be in order to accommodate the form which is not indigenous to the places which the language has traveled. Shamsul Rahman Farooqi Sahab says about the ghazal that it has a universe of its own, not just in terms of radif and kafiya, but also in terms of the recurring motifs like saki, sher, jam, nazmana, Sir was talking about in Muhammad, which are specific to those regions where the ghazal has traveled. Similarly, in Kashmiri, there is a set of images that invoke a certain meaning in the lyric, plus there are some sound patterns. Some constant motifs are yambarzal, the morning glow, parrot, sparrow, love. So these are all the love poems, mystic connotations, which are not easily transportable in the actual. So it might also have like some kind of, like for example, man, which is in Urdu is, in English it would be like if you're talking about saki or man, it would be alcohol, bartender, or But in Urdu it is love, it could be beloved, it could be, it could be the forbidden love, it had many connotations. But in Kashmiri, it has a single connotation which is very mystic, and it is like a complete submission to God. Morifat. Mine is morifat in Kashmir. Morifat is like being one with God, giving away everything, being in complete submission. No, not at all. No, not. I've never encountered any material connotation of mine in Kashmir. No. So though there might be a Persian thing also in here, because there's Hafiz Shirazi's couplet I'm remembering where he says that Dharmasave man kada halal astu lekin ye huye thui sarve bulandam haramas. That in my religion, alcohol is allowed, but only if I can see your face in the goblet. And this refers to, because Hafiz was a Jew, Rasulullah, the Prophet, because on the day of judgment, Muslims' belief is that Rasulullah will be the saki, he will be the one who will be giving alcohol, the jam of concert, also to everybody. So it really had Persian influence that way, but otherwise I've never encountered anything material related to alcohol in Kashmir. Mine is, mine is jam. So they talk of mine and then they become hanafila, one with God, and total submission. So similarly, the use of radif, for example, in Urdu poetry, like when you use radif, is the repetition of one kind of a word time and again. So I think in Urdu, it actually gives a sense of wonder, that sound, and also a sense of wonder, which is not easily unless somebody is doing it very well, but easily it's not transported into, say, into English. Similarly, in Kashmiri, we have these red ring, lines, like for example, Lo Latiedo. So this poet calls in the literature a woman, Lo Latiedo. Latie is not a mad woman, she's, it's an endearing sort of. But when I see like some of the writers, translators who have translated, they left it as such, as sound, Lo Latiedo. So at the end of every, after 4 lines, there would be Lo Latiedo, they will leave it like that. So then we talk about tone and age. So the 14th century mystic that we talk about, Lalit writes in Bach. Bach is a very old form, in a Shivite and Rishi tradition. So Bach consists of 4 lines, each of which is loose tetrameter. The first syllable is always stressed, but then the stress falls alternatively. The last syllable is generally unstressed. The Bach begins with authority, but fades out in the end. This pattern, says Deja Madhu, makes the Bach soft touch at the end, makes it soothing to the air and effective to the uninitiated. So this 14th century Kashmiri translating into the 21st century English, what does it end up in? Should the English go backward or the Kashmiri move forward so that they meet somewhere is the question. So Bach's are mystic words of wisdom, often cryptic and witty, much more depending on where the stress lies. What is emphasized and what is said in the lighter note. When I interviewed Professor Neja Mattu, she said the same thing, and I asked her, how do you go about the translation? She said, I go by instinct, and my instinct is driven and commanded by the tone. Tonality. So, and then the loss of ambiguity. So the other day we were talking about this, one of our friends was talking about one of the Majaz's couplets. I don't remember the couplet exactly the meter, but it says that Zindagi Gunah ka hasil hai, or jab tak Zindagi mein Gunahgar, but this is not the correct meter in which it is said. But he told us, and Maz, we immediately said that it refers to Adam's sin. But he doesn't mention Adam. He says sin, which is definitely 100% Adam's sin. But do we have the liberty to include Adam here? Or keep Adam outside of the domain? Because if he is maintaining that ambiguity, he has the right to maintain that ambiguity. So that is the most important point. Because ambiguity is especially in poetry, is something one wouldn't want to lose. It's the most precious thing. So that is what it is. So in order to maintain the point's ambiguities and obscurities, do not over-explain what I think, do not provide information that the poet does not want to give. So humor, for instance, is another thing, which is humor is a thing of community. The humor is between communities. You share humor between friends, and there's a different humor for everybody. So humor is one thing. Then, for example, in Urdu, one of my friends said that she was translating Urdu humor, and she was encountered with the word hajamat. मैं उसकी हजामत करूँगा. Hajamat would mean कि उसकी दाढ़ी वाली. But Urdu, it has a different meaning. Means I will beat him out or whatever. That's a sort of thing. Yes. So that's also I've encountered in many places, where these things have to be taken care of. So I'm arguing the kind of middle ground then between extreme literariness and free translation. It seems to me that we translators ought to try most carefully to understand the original poem very accurately. Then, digest it, and through a careful translation, bring about something which respects both the languages and has the scope to give birth to a third one. The bringing of again the analogy of crossing over, which is what happens when when a baby is born, or any baby is born, or a human baby or any other baby, there is a crossover of genes which happens. The genes of the mother and the father mix in a very random form. Nothing governs. There's no rule. You don't know which gene activates you, or like what should your nose be like father or mother. It's just that moment, whatever happens by chance. And the baby has both copies of genes, the mother and father, but it also has its own individuality. So that is where also they talk about the bridge between the chromosomes and the, so those are the bridges, and that's, I think, that is the space they
Thank you for that extremely fascinating paper. Ramesh Akhilari always gives me goosebumps. It has always been like that. I'm so glad you invoked his memory. I mean, October, this is Translators Day, and I'll tell you, he is the greatest translator we probably ever had in modern Indian literature. So, and I absolutely love the way in which you talked about translation being this really organic process, you know, which is unpredictable in some ways, and you carry not just the logic of the text or the meaning, and you carry the rhetoric, and through the rhetoric, the affect. So, in that sense, falling in love is something that is inevitable. You do not fall in love with the text you probably translated. Like Spivak once talked about, and I think she's totally right. Anyway, that was, and also, I'm so glad that you kind of moved away from the strictly academic translation studies conventions of talking about translation.
You know, so much about
yeah, and weaving, you know, I am weaving. I mean, at some point of time, I would like to really explore this understanding of weaving, you know, this really complex and ambiguous, ambivalent way in which weaving is understood, spinning and weaving. Because as we very well know that before, and here I am talking about as a historian, before colonialism, weaving was the single most important industry that India had, and women had a very, very important role to play as spinners. I mean, at what point, and spinning was a very, very important source of income for most families. And at what point does it become, you know, shameful, etc.? And that's why, you know, as a historian, I think it's so important, I want to say this, it's so important to retain that ambiguity, that ambivalence, that is, because as a historian, once I would not necessarily look at the literary aspects of the story, but the historical aspects. And if we were to kind of edit it out in the translation, it would be such a loss, because after all, translated texts are read not just by readers who are interested in literature, but also by readers who are interested in research in, say, history or sociology and so on. So it's very important to think about the text and also, you know, a historical, something that's involved historically and socially. Thank you very much.
That you translated your mother's story. Do you think you went through the emotions that she must have gone through when you were writing the story?
Yes, one is the close affinity. She's my mother, yes, of course. I mean, those little nuances, just because it's shame, it's a very big word. But I know it has to be, you know, diluted a lot in order to, you know, to express what she actually wanted. But if you read the story, there's also this, you know, this woman, why does she actually decide? Because the husband is once going to a party and he doesn't have that shawl or anything, and then he becomes ill. And she tries to borrow from other person, but that doesn't. So all that kind of poverty and, you know, the honor of the family, holding up, that women often do. So that kind of thing. Yes, I could exactly, you know, see how it is. Because what in those times it was difficult to read the ends for everyone. So that's kind
Was
of.
this like writing your own story and in the course of the translation?
Excuse me, can you reserve questions to the end because Aglami wants me to speak? Invite you.
It's such an honor to be here in Delhi on World Translation Day. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Sir Deklari, for this opportunity. Personally, I believe that translation is eminently worthy of celebration every day. Speaking for myself, I absolutely thrive in multilingual complexity. I have two mother tongues, English and Tamil, and one mother-in-law tongue, Malayalam. And without translation, I think we would be landlocked in, I cannot imagine a monocultural, one nation, one language kind of world at all. So people like me are bilingual, multilingual by necessity, and I see my own life as a microcosm of the multilingual, multicultural Indian subcontinent, which in turn is a microcosm